So my name is Michele Mastroianni. I'm an associate professor at OCAD University. I teach in the Masters of Design in Strategic Foresight and Innovation. So that is a multidisciplinary master's, really geared towards people with professional interests in design thinking, in foresight, and in strategy. Um, I am a political scientist by training. That's what my PhD is in, and I came to teach at OCAD based on my policy experience in around innovation systems and policy design. So I teach in that particular program. I teach a lot of the social science elements, a lot of the ideas around the human elements that impact how we think and how we look at design and how we look at the social economic and business solutions that we offer. So that's kind of in a very um, rough nutshell what I do. Yeah, so I think in terms of our island, both based on my own background and on OCAD's background, so I'd say at the moment it's the OCAD island plus me in terms of our involvement with the archipelago of design. I think what that means then is we bring what's called the human-centered design thinking aspects to the archipelago, where we look at stakeholder opinions, views, and expertise, and put an emphasis on the empathy aspects around design thinking, which sometimes, for example, in military design, you may not see that emphasis. And in fact, with some professionals in military design, I know they try not to dwell on the empathy aspect, but I think there is use for it. Because of my political science background, I bring in those kind of the power elements, the consideration around policy and policy effectiveness, the complexity of policy, and how things many times don't work upon first entry, and really expanding the issues that the archipelago works on beyond the strict military strategy aspects to involve all those many social aspects, such as the diversity aspects and the connections to other levels of government and policy in that sense. So bringing that kind of overall complexity to the table. It's also one, we have a great through the program. We are, as a result, are able to draw upon a lot of well-trained master students who are also experienced professionals with 10 plus years of professional experience, who come from a variety of backgrounds that are not typical in the defense world, but also atypical in the civilian world, because we have such a multidisciplinary background. So everything from lawyers, engineers, and nurses to opera singers and artists and graphic designers. So we bring that mix of insight. So I would say that's kind of what our island brings to the table in terms of the archipelago. I would say the first thing is that I didn't know where to start either. In fact, I didn't know when I started that I was doing design. And so I think you would be surprised at the fact that you're probably already doing different things that could be considered design and design thinking. If it's structured thinking about different scenarios, if it's or even unstructured, if you're just thinking about different possibilities, thinking about what other people think, thinking about how to best get to a result and all the different possibilities of getting to that result, you're already kind of doing that design thinking. So I think that's the first, maybe not advice, but the first, words of assurance I would give somebody approaching design thinking. And a lot of I think a good approach to design thinking is one that draws upon your own experiences in a very strong way and kind of puts them forward. So I think that's one piece of advice is, be prepared to ask yourself, what are your biases? What are your make explicit your own background, and embrace it, be conscious of it, but be conscious of the fact that it's going to impact how you do things. And so the next step then is seeing how that interweaves or intermeshes or conflicts with the backgrounds of other people. So again, it's not necessarily to say that that conflict is bad, or that even if it's maybe a negative conflict, that you'll be able to solve it. But just that awareness, I think, is the first very important step to getting the most out of design thinking. I think it's my other elevator pitch would be: ask all the dumb questions you can ask. Question the most obvious things first. You'd be surprised about what can happen. I think that would be my elevator pitch. I think part of, speaking personally, not necessarily about my own, not about the OCAD in general, not about my colleagues or my students, but I think one of my surprising, one of the only talents that I have, I think, is the willingness to ask the quote unquote dumb questions, or question the obvious, because I want to make sure that I'm understanding what other people seem to be understanding. And I think that is actually, has been very helpful, because it actually helps you uncover those instances where either everybody's been too afraid to ask the obvious question because they think everybody else knows it, but they don't. Or all of a sudden it reveals problematic assumptions. So I think the elevator pitch, again, is like, ask the dumb questions. Don't assume everything is obvious, and you'd be surprised at what you could find. So I think definitely the key difference there is that I came about it without knowing I was doing design thinking. So I'm not a designer, I'm not a graphic designer, I'm not a service designer, I'm not an industrial designer. A lot of my colleagues are, in that sense. And I didn't come to this place from understanding military design or the military aspect in terms of the Archipelagos community. So my experience is one of kind of doing it by accident. So encountering policy problems across different areas of work, mostly around technological commercialization, biotech industries, IT industries, and how they were looking to support their innovation systems. And the policy recommendations we were making, because we were very conscious of not making academic, to use that meaningless term now, that we didn't want things to be academic. We didn't want our solutions to be ivory tower ideal solutions. We wanted our solutions to be very practical for the people on the ground. And by the people on the ground, I don't mean political representatives at the very top, but actual practitioners who would have to implement things and get dirty. And so our approach was one of prototyping a policy proposal, letting people kick it, bash it, iterating it, and then reproposing, so that you have that mix of useful theory that helps you solve the problem with a lot of those critical practical elements that a lot of times the other consultants might not have, or other researchers might not have thought about, because they weren't getting into the weeds and into the dirt. So I think that is, so mine was, like I said, it was by accident. It is what design thinking is, that iteration, that kind of repetition of prototyping. But we didn't do it saying this is how designers do it, and therefore this is the approach that we're taking. We just kind of did it because it made sense. We wanted people to be able to work with it, and so that's the approach that we took. Well, so for me, when I plan my, even if in my teaching, let's use it that way, right? even in my teaching, when I plan a lecture, when I plan workshops and so on, I have the broad level objectives of what I want to achieve. I know what I want to do. But a lot of the topics that we're covering are fairly new, and there is a lot of change happening in the educational system. So when we talk about, the elements of diversity, when we talk about decolonization objectives of the university, and so on, this is a lot of uncharted waters for many of us, in the sense that it's changing how we do things, from very kind of traditional approaches, or not even traditional, but just from approaches that we didn't have to be too conscious about, that we didn't have to think about. But now we are thinking about it, and we're exploring as we go. We're also iterating as we go. So when I plan my lessons and when I plan my teaching on design and let's say research methods or something like that, I'll come to it with certain objectives. I'll have material that I think more or less fills those objectives, but I will allow the space for my students to react and critique, and then to some extent help co-create what the next lesson will be and what that next, what that experience is. So that co-creation is very important in human-centered design. It's something that as teachers, we don't use as much, because we want to give as much material as we can, and we have certain timelines to deliver it. But I think when, especially, we're getting into these new and sensitive topics, new in the sense of emphasis from the university, obviously they've been issues for a long time, but now that we're getting into these sensitive topics, that co-creation and that iteration is crucial to make sure that everybody gets the message, two, gets the most experience out of it, and three, feels like they're in a safe enough place, never a completely safe space, a safe enough place to explore the issues and be willing to discuss them and explore them. I think, I have a couple of projects that are ongoing, and so I'm looking forward to see how they play out. One in the civilian space, where we're looking at small communities in rural areas and trying to help them become more independent in terms of their strategy and policy making, and more innovative. So it's always exciting to see where the fruits of your labor are going. But in terms of future work, one thing that a potential project that I'm proposing is looking at the knowledge resources that in the Canadian Armed Forces are evident and held by the non-commissioned members, right? I think there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, a lot of creativity, and a lot of innovation that is held in potential. Whether it's used or not is a different story. By these members who may or may not feel the permission or the support to draw upon that knowledge and deliver innovative solutions to the problems that they face. A lot of times they'll do it in the field because they have to, and they have to adapt. But what I want to do is see if we could take that adaptiveness, that creativity, and then provide an institutional structure that supports it and then helps us create a bigger space for it that the Canadian Armed Forces can benefit from. So that's exciting. Whether we can find the funding and pursue it and so on is always the question mark, right? So I think design thinking is, it's a lot. It's many things. Obviously, there's some training to it and so on. But I think if I was to really, it's being aware that you don't know everything and that you're not going to be able to know everything in a complex problem, and yet still being able to move forward fruitfully, carefully, in a way that is open to challenging your own perceptions, and accessing and acknowledging the knowledge and expertise that other people hold that you're working with, right? So I don't think I think design thinking has moved away from the I'm the expert, listen to me and do what I say kind of thinking. That is an element in design. And especially used to see that more in product design or architecture, or whatever. But now, really, the design thing that we practice in OCAD is that co-generative, or at least um, acknowledgement of other people's expertise and your own lack of awareness of some crucial element that is out there, right? So you have to be comfortable in that uncertainty. You have to be aware that you're not going to know everything you know. And so design thinking is really that way of kind of navigating that uncertainty while trying to find a solution in a very practical sense. So I was on a project where we had what I thought were very clear discussions with clients. This is in a different organization, um, with clients who wanted us to design a research project for them and carry it out, and then help them with modernizing their organization. Let's use that in order to be less specific and not kind of call out names and organizations. Um, and so we went about the work. We thought we had a very good, clear understanding. We went back and forth with the organization, kind of making sure that they understood what we were doing, and we had sign off, and everybody was all good to go. What then became evident was we got it wrong. When we did our midterm review and report, the board of the organization absolutely hated what we did not like what we were doing. Said, in fact, that we got the project wrong and that we were not delivering what they wanted. In contrast to the earlier conversations where we had been dealing with management, a different group of people. And so the adversity there, I guess, or the challenge was having an organization that had different levels of management, and I had assumed that the decision making only rested in the hands of the person that I was dealing with initially, and that was the wrong assumption. And I didn't follow my instinct when I started picking up some potential red flags as we were doing the initial project. I just chalked it up to somebody being a little bit of a difficult interviewee or a difficult person to deal with, rather than listening to what they were actually saying and then following and then trying to pursue and understand what was going on there. I was kind of more fixated on my timelines and, ticking off the interviews rather than kind of listening to the alarm bells. And so, luckily for us, for my organization, we had a paper trail of initial communication where from our end, everything did seem that it had been agreed upon. It's just really, organizationally speaking, the failure was on their end, where their two levels of governance were not speaking to each other. But ultimately, I'd say part of the failure is on me for not having picked up on those signals and kind of taking everybody down this road of eventual conflict. And there was lawyers involved and so on and so forth. For my organization, it came out, I think, all right in the end, though a pain in the butt, and we had to get our lawyers involved. But I think that kind of adversity taught me in the sense of one, be aware of other organizations and other organizational structures and how that can impact your own work. Two, don't get so caught up in the checklist of getting stuff done. Be aware, if there are red flags and alarm bells, take a pause for a second, explore them, and listen to what the other person is saying, and don't just chalk it up to, that was a pain. And I think it just made me a better team manager overall, in terms of getting that. So it's not quite the adversity that maybe you're looking for. I think adversity is a little deeper. I've in terms of adversity and so on, dealing with adversity throughout my career, which may have been, getting through difficult projects or dealing with different situations. I think there's just a lot of it is perseverance and stubbornness, kind of willing to stick to something to make sure it gets delivered. But I know others have had much harder times and more adverse conditions than I have. It's funny. It's not an individual project. I mean, I could say, oh, I was getting tenure as a professor and so on. Obviously, as a young academic, you try to, that's one of the goals that you reach, and then you reach it, and then so the next step is then what, right? So that's kind of where I'm at. So I achieved tenure, hooray. Now I have to, so maybe that goes back to the adversity question. So my current adversity is just figuring out what I want to do that's significant next. And then what is significant in questioning that. But in terms of my accomplishment, I think it's not just getting tenure, it's getting into a position and a place where I can be considered an expert in my field to some extent, where I myself believe that label, which is always the imposter syndrome that people feel. Maybe getting over that imposter syndrome to some extent, and being able to finally get into the projects where I see the direct impact on the stakeholders I'm working with in a positive way, right? So that, whereas before you're working on other people's projects and you may or may not see the impact, now I think my sense of achievement is coming from seeing that impact and seeing the appreciation of it, and and then being able to continue on with that work and not being worried about somebody stopping that work. So it's a very general answer, but I think that's bigger than any individual project that's been finished or any kind of individual kind of congratulations, right? So any individual kudos. Oh, it's taught me so much. I am, funny enough, I am comfortable working on my own. I've always known that. I think I always joke, COVID has made me more misanthropic, but I don't think that's accurate. I think COVID has taught me that even on what would appear to be the most straightforward issues, there's going to be disagreement. Okay. And it has taught me it has emphasized the lesson in the sense that simply saying, oh, whoever else, whatever other side of an issue, you can't just dismiss them by saying, well, they're stupid or it doesn't make sense, it's irrational, whatever. That's actually not accurate. I think what it has taught me is that if you look more deeply, there are reasons for positions being held. The onus is on us to try to understand those reasons. Because if we don't, as much as we might feel righteous about our own position, mutually acceptable solutions are not going to be reached. And even unilaterally acceptable solutions are not going to be maintained. Because the conflict that emerges from ignoring the reasons and basis for decisions from other sides of the issue are going to come back and shake your tree. So that's what's COVID's taught. One of the things that COVID has taught.